Videocast 5 of the Muscuentos Black Box podcast, co-sponsored by muscuentos.com and Indwelling Language. This episode is developed and presented by me, Sarah Elizabeth Cottrell, teacher, research enthusiast, and the blogger behind muscuentos.com. The topic of this episode is a 2014 article called Re-Engaging the Interface Debate, Strong, Weak, None, or All. The authors are Zhao Hong Han and Rosette Finneran. Han is a professor with a distinguished history of researching questions on how second language is learnable and teachable and where the two intersect. Finneran is one of her doctoral students. The purpose of this article is pretty clear in the title. The authors want to keep the field talking about what is known as the interface debate. Which is what, exactly? Almost 40 years ago, Krashen first started talking about people having two separate ways of learning language. Either they subconsciously acquire language, the way small children do by interacting with the language speakers around them. That's implicit learning and knowledge. Or they consciously learn it, the way students do by filling in conjugation worksheets in a language classroom. That's explicit learning and knowledge. And a related question naturally popped up and has been actively debated ever since. Do the two types of knowledge connect or overlap at all? Here's a major corollary. Can learned language ever become acquired language? That's the question that is the interface debate. Researchers investigate whether there exists between explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge a strong interface, a weak interface, none at all, or some combination of those answers. Before we get into what the debate looks like, let's figure out more clearly what explicit and implicit knowledge are. For Han and Finneran, and me too, a good definition to follow is Rod Ellis's commonly used explanation of the two types of knowledge. For Ellis, explicit knowledge is knowledge of prescriptive grammatical rules, what you access through your controlled processing, typically when you have time to plan. I'll be using a lot of my explicit knowledge as I plan my Spanish language conference presentation for this fall on using commercials to incorporate culture. I'll be outlining and preparing slides and all the while trying to make sure, for example, that all my articles and adjectives related to the word for commercial are masculine. On the other hand, also with a nod to Ellis, implicit knowledge is procedural knowledge of rules, what you use automatically, when you're talking naturalistically. I'll be using a lot of my implicit knowledge of Spanish when I'm actually in my presentation and participants ask me questions or invite my comment. I won't be taking a lot of time to think and plan out my responses, but rather usually answer naturalistically. So is there overlap? Can you consciously learn language that you'll later be able to access fluently in the middle of a natural conversation without thinking about it? Where the researchers land on this answer depends a lot on how they answer another question. Is everything learnable and therefore teachable? Researchers who believe that there is any interface between implicit and explicit knowledge imply that the answer is yes, everything is learnable and everything is teachable. In the strong interface camp, the loudest voice is that of De Keyser, who applies skill acquisition theory to language learning. First you develop knowledge that, and then as you practice you develop knowledge how, and then finally you enter a stage where language use becomes much more spontaneous and effortless for you. Another loud voice in the strong interface camp is Schmidt with his noticing hypothesis. You can't learn a foreign language, or anything else for that matter, through subliminal perception. He implies that consciously paying attention is the only way adults learn language. Let's turn to the loudest voices in the weak interface camp, and they're both named Ellis. First, there's Rod Ellis. He says yes, explicit knowledge can become implicit knowledge, but it's a question of when. Explicit learning can't help if the target feature is one the learner isn't developmentally ready for. But for elements that don't depend on some stage of readiness, then the explicit knowledge can become implicit knowledge anytime. Advocating an even weaker interface, but still an overlap, is the other Ellis, Nick, not Rod. He says that the natural process guys are probably right, that language learning is largely implicit, happening as learners experience relevant input, but that for second language learning you've got to take in a host of other factors like, for one, that the learner already speaks another language, and for another, there's all that noticing going on whether you like it or not. The learner knows there's language instruction happening here, and their learned attention is tuned to it. Cue the funeral dirge for implicit acquisition in a room that says language class over the door. So we can use some explicit instruction in the form of feedback, helping students recognize where their first language is interfering and helping them notice what they should be noticing, in the hopes that they'll internalize those features and make them part of their implicit knowledge. The two weak interface positions differ in whether explicit knowledge is really necessary, but they agree on this. Explicit knowledge may help where implicit knowledge fails, and of course, that everything is learnable. Let's go visit the non-interface camp, where guys like Krashen, Schwartz, Prescott, and Paradis are saying, no way, Ellis's and all your ilk, not everything is learnable. And your brain can't turn explicit learning into implicit knowledge you can use automatically. If you know anything about second language acquisition theories, you know that this is the one that has drawn the most fire. The criticism is strong. 1, it's not even scientific because it's not provable that there's no interface. 2, the fundamental terms like learning and acquisition haven't even been acceptably defined. And 3, the amount of control required here to make the argument in a study is unachievable. You'd have to completely control the input and the task and the measurement just to start. In contrast, the authors here acknowledge empirical studies accumulating at a stunning pace, favoring some sort of interface. But Hahn and Finneran bring up the issues with this research as well, such as that most studies are short-term and use rules that have been shown to be easily learnable anyway. And then you have all the research supporting the position that correcting grammar is not only ineffective, it might actually be harmful, which non-interface adherents say is only natural when language learning that's useful for spontaneous production is implicit anyway. So are linguists like Nick Ellis right, and explicit learning can help where implicit learning fails? Or are linguists like Paradis right, and competence is all about implicit learning and there's no such thing as it failing? The answer isn't that clear-cut. I can well remember when I sat down with a group of linguistics professors and students and De Keyser in 2005. And though sometimes his written position seems so strong, in casual conversation he will tell you it's just not that clear. Lots of issues are giving researchers pause, not the least of which are great differences that can be identified among different learners, and even within the same learner. Hahn and Finneran point out that on both sides we have the same problem. Everyone is so attached to their position that they ignore the counter-evidence. Human nature, right? I must be right, so let me figure out how your interpretation of the evidence is wrong, or I'll simply ignore it. But the open mind has to admit that it's been compellingly shown that some explicit instruction can become implicit, and as De Keyser says, the position isn't that instruction is helpful. It's that instruction is helpful to some extent, for some forms, for some students, at some point in the learning process. Hahn and Finneran want to re-engage the debate to spur researchers on to answer this much better question for instructed language learning. In what areas is there a strong, weak, or no interface between explicit and implicit knowledge? In order to encourage research in this area, the authors present some analysis of data from Hahn's own research on fossilization. So let's look at that briefly before we wrap up this episode. Fossilization refers to the phenomenon in which, even though a learner is exposed to lots of appropriate input and is motivated to learn and has lots of opportunities to practice, she still continues to make the same mistake. It's like that particular feature got pounded into a rock and there's no hope of getting it out. Hahn and Finneran's examples from Hahn's previous research are pretty complicated. But what it really boils down to is they found evidence that in the same learner's language, it can seem like explicit and implicit knowledge are interacting and aren't interacting, maybe depending on the grammar feature in question, and maybe with the same grammar feature. So Hahn and Finneran say, join the team everyone, and let's find out what features overlap and which ones don't. Wow, so where does that leave us? Here's my take on it. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to prove any of this, so what's the point? As soon as a study comes out, someone else brings up the myriad methodological issues. If you can't agree on what implicit learning is, how can you begin to prove that it's what the learner is doing, so you can look for any results in the production? And how can we guess whether the production is underscored by implicit or explicit knowledge? So perhaps a good focus for language teachers is to keep helping students focus on developing language they can use for communicating meaning and place less emphasis on whether the knowledge underlying it is explicit or implicit. I'm not sure what Hahn and Finneran would tell us to do otherwise. Here's a more concrete, relevant application. We cannot likely have similar expectations for presentational and interpersonal modes. Expecting these skills to advance at approximately the same pace is unrealistic and doesn't address what kind of classroom instruction will further one or the other. In the typical world language program right now, our students are not developing interpersonal implicit skills because we are constantly asking them to perform presentational explicit tasks. And the two do not likely have a strong interface, though there is evidence for some kind of interface on different aspects of grammar and vocabulary. One last comment. Following Nick Ellis's reasoning, as soon as a student signs up for something called a language class, immersion or camp or otherwise, you have lost the benefit of unconscious implicit learning for research purposes. Students know they're learning. We're going to have to figure out how to find a balance, and I can think of two ways. One comes from the recent Musicuentos Black Box Videocast by Albert Fernandez, and that is making the input as compelling as possible to help them forget their learning language as often as we can. The other is like Nick says, giving the kind of feedback that will work with their learned attention. What kind of feedback is that? Well, that's a topic for a future videocast. The Musicuentos Black Box podcast is a collection of media resources intended to form an easy-to-access, easy-to-understand bridge between quality second language acquisition research and teacher practice in the world language classroom. For more information about the Musicuentos Black Box podcast collection of resources, including ways you can help keep this resource available to teachers everywhere, visit musicuentos.com/blackbox.